We have a book at home. It's called Daily Meditations with Pope Francis. And like most good things in my life, it was my wife's idea to do this. A recent entry spoke to me. Pope Francis writes, "Creation is beautiful. It fills us with awe and it remains a good work. But," he says, "there's also violence and division and disagreement. And those things occur when man stops contemplating beauty and goodness. And they happen when man withdraws into his own selfishness. Indeed, as Father Freytag powerfully pointed out just a couple weeks ago, the news is filled with images of what happens when man stops contemplating goodness and when we fall into our own selfishness and violence and division come forth. Perhaps most visible in our minds lately, we have to add the very tragic headline of the loss of a single mother of 3 from Renton. Today is the World Day of Vocations. And while it's often focused on God's calling to the priesthood and diaconate and religious life, we recognize that vocation, God's calling, begins with his universal call to holiness. His universal call, which we're reminded of in today's reading from Acts of the Apostles, Paul and Barnabas being sent from the early church as an instrument of salvation for all of mankind. And today we have an opportunity to intentionally contemplate how goodness can and does show up in our fallen world. I've been so frustrated with the headlines that, perhaps inspired by Father's prayer that he gave us, "Jesus, I trust in you," I set out to seek good news, literally typing into my web browser, "good news." And immediately, edifying headlines started to show up on my computer screen. For instance, I learned that there is a biker gang that recently stood guard around the clock to protect a young girl from her abuser. They're called the Bikers Against Child Abuse. And yes, they wear leather, and they look tough, and yes, their leader is named Tombstone. And they're the most loving, virtuous, protective men. I also learned that in India, a restaurant owner recently put a refrigerator outside so that the hungry can have access to good food 24 hours a day. You see, he had recently noticed many people rummaging through his trash to find something to eat, and so he acted on an inspiration. Or how about the kids in an audience who helped a boy with autism sing the song "Let It Go" at a talent show because he forgot the words? His mother was waiting in the wings, and she said it was magical. The whole community rallied around and supported him. Just a few immediate examples of goodness at work. And they all point to there being a source of that goodness and of that beauty. And indeed, God has given us a normal vehicle to help us foster that goodness, and it's called the family. In The Joy of Love, it's Pope Francis's recently published exhortation. He reminds us of how our universal call to holiness is connected to the family. This is the document that's just been published after a couple of years of the church reflecting on the needs of the family in these times. And the first paragraph really sets the tone, and I'll paraphrase it. The joy of love experienced by families is also the joy of the church. And even though there are many signs of crisis in the institution of marriage, there remains a desire. There is a desire to marry and a desire to form families, especially among young people. And that desire is an inspiration to the church. He goes on to appeal to us, to encourage us to recognize that Jesus is the vocation of the family. It's a very nice, neatly phrased series of words. Jesus is the vocation of the family, and when we think about it, it means even more that the outpouring sacrificial love of God is the call of families. He also encourages us to contemplate the beauty of marriage and to contemplate the beauty of children, to contemplate the beauty of family. And as we're doing that, we thus avoid withdrawing into our own selfishness. I encourage you to prayerfully read and to prayerfully contemplate the words of the joy of love yourself, and not to simply rely on what the media might be telling you about it. And I also encourage you to prayerfully search for good news in the media headlines. Do it daily. Make it part of your routine, and you will see the good and the beautiful Spirit of God at work, even in everyday life. You'll see that the Spirit of God is promoting life and family, even when someone's going through a crisis or a difficulty. I also found some headlines that I thought related somewhat to family. A firefighter paying for a family's electric bill so they can keep their child on a ventilator. A teacher who started a program to teach important life lessons to boys because he recognized they do not have fathers. Or baristas at a coffee shop taking time to pray with a customer at the drive-through window because they recognized that she showed up in tears. Her husband had recently passed. And to encourage greater family connection, a Chick-fil-A restaurant was giving away free ice cream cones to families simply for making it through their entire meal without using their cell phone. Rewarding the right things. Or how about our Holy Father, Pope Francis himself, just yesterday, reminding us how actions speak so much louder than words, bringing 12 Syrian refugees back to Rome aboard his papal flight. 3 families, 6 children among them, all Muslims. He says that it was the result of an inspiration, no doubt from contemplating goodness and beauty. My sisters and brothers, on this World Day of Vocations, let us thank Jesus, our Good Shepherd, for helping us to hear his voice in the midst of the world. And let us also remember that God's primary calling is to holiness, and it is offered to all nations, all of humanity. Let us thank God for the gifts of marriage and the gift of family as the core building block of civilization, also the normal vehicle for fostering those vocations to the priesthood and diaconate and religious life. And like Paul and Barnabas modeled for us in being an instrument of salvation to the nations, let us set out to make good news headlines wherever we go.